The cold came in with her. That was what the guests remembered afterward. And it was not the black gown itself, nor the severe line of her bonnet's brim, nor the absence of a single white ribbon or spring flower that every other woman in St. Crispin's had managed to find somewhere. They remembered the cold, and then they remembered the silence, and then they realized both had entered through the same door. Cecily Vane walked the length of the nave as though she had done it 1,000 times, which she had. She had been christened in this church, confirmed in this church, and had stood at this same stone font 12 times for cousins and neighbors and the children of her father's tenants, and she had always stood in the particular way she stood now, shoulders straight, chin at a measured height, eyes not quite fixed on anything ahead of her, as though the act of looking too specifically at the room might give the room cause to comment. She wore full mourning. Black crepe, high-necked, long-gloved, the bonnet's veil pinned up rather than down so that her face was entirely visible. She had made the choice deliberately. If she was to be stared at, she would give them a face to stare at. The pew she chose was on the left side, 3 rows from the back, which was neither close enough to claim a position she no longer held, nor far enough to be understood as hiding. This, too, was deliberate. She had been deliberate about a great many things in the past 3 months, because deliberateness was the only authority she had remaining to her, and she had learned to spend it carefully. It was the Earl of Rexborough who looked up. He was seated at the front, in the family pew, which was not precisely where he belonged, but which he occupied by virtue of being the infant's godfather. He sat at an angle to the nave, turned slightly in the way a man turns when he has been waiting for something without admitting to himself what it is. He looked up when the cold came in. He saw the black gown before he saw the face. Then he saw the face. He had known Cecily Vane 8 years ago, when she was 16, and he had been a young man with a wife and prospects, and a habit of visiting Ashcroft Park because her father, Sir Edmund, played chess better than anyone in the county. She had brought tea in from the kitchen once because the housekeeper had taken ill, and she had set the tray down without ceremony and told her father that she would sit in if he didn't mind, because she had been following the match through the keyhole, and it was not sporting to leave her outside. Sir Edmund had laughed until his eyes watered. Hugh Ashford had looked at the girl and thought, with a private certainty he could not have explained, that she would never be the kind of woman who waited in corridors. He was looking at her now, and she was in the one dress that said precisely what no one dared ask her to say aloud. The people around him did not look at him, looking at her. They were engaged in the careful not looking that polite society performs when something real enters a room that has been arranged entirely for performance. Cecily arranged herself in the pew. She folded her gloved hands over her reticule, which was black leather, and sat in her lap with a certain small weight she had been conscious of all morning. Inside it was her father's silver pocket watch. She had carried it every day since the last week of January, when her father had pressed it into her hand with the particular firmness of a man settling his accounts, and had said, with an effort at the dry humor that had been his characteristic mode for 61 years, that the entail had no claim on a watch. She had not laughed because his hand had been so cold. She had put the watch in her reticule and not cried until she reached her own room, and since then she had carried it to everything, including this. Stay close. There is more here than a black gown and a stone church. There is the whole of a life being held together with exactly that much visible effort, and it is worth watching. 3 months. Sir Edmund Vane had been dead 3 months, and the entail had moved with the particular merciless efficiency of English property law, and Ashcroft Park had passed to the male line as everyone had always known it must, and the child being christened today was Philip Vane's son and heir, and the final proof, if any were needed, that the law did not concern itself with who had loved a house longest. Cecily had grown up at Ashcroft Park. She had known the name of every tenant farmer on the property, the precise state of every fence, the way the morning light came through the library windows in June, when the linden was in flower, and made the room smell like something a person could live inside forever. She had known all of it, and the law did not care. She had been told, by her aunt, and by Mr. Hobbs the solicitor, and by one or two well-meaning neighbors, that her situation might have been otherwise if she had married when she had the chance. 3 years ago, a Mr. Farrow had made her an offer. He was a decent man, a landowner of moderate means, steady enough in character, if not in wit, and she had refused him, believing she had time. She had been 21. Her father had been 60, and in apparent health, and the nearest male Vane who stood to inherit had been a distant cousin in Northumberland, whom none of them had met. She had believed she had time. She had not. Her father had loved her refusal privately. He had told her, the night after Mr. Farrow came and went, that he had been almost afraid she would accept him, and that he thought she was worth something better, and that he was sorry the world was arranged in such a way that the question had to be asked of her at all. She had been glad of his saying it. She had been glad of it every day since, and more glad than she could account for since January, when she could no longer ask him anything. She sat in the pew in her black dress, and the church filled around her. Hugh Ashford had made a promise to Sir Edmund Vane a year before the old man died. They had been friends since school. Two young men thrown together by circumstance, who had found, against all expectation, that they suited each other's company, and the friendship had persisted across decades and marriages and losses and the particular drift that life produces in men who do not live near each other. He had visited Ashcroft Park a dozen times across 40 years. He had been at Edmund's side when Edmund's wife died, and Edmund had been at his side in the terrible days after Marianne. He had promised, in that last visit when Sir Edmund was still well enough to sit at the chessboard, but already moving with the careful economy of a man who has started taking stock of what he has left to give, that he would be godfather to any child born to the Vane line. He had not known then that the child would be Philip's. He had made the promise because Edmund had asked him, and because he honored his promises to the dead. It was the one discipline he had maintained without exception since Marianne. He kept it by sitting in this pew, in this church, on this morning, and looking across the nave at a woman in mourning who had come to witness the final settling of everything she had lost. The vicar arrived. The party assembled. The infant, a red-faced and unimpressed creature in a long white robe, was carried in by his nurse. Philip Vane stood at the font with his wife, Harriet, whose gown was pale yellow silk, and whose expression was the careful performance of a woman determined that nothing should be permitted to cast a shadow on her mourning. Harriet had not spoken to Cecily at the church door. She had spoken to her sister, just loudly enough, with the particular pitch of a woman who intends to be overheard by everyone except the one she is speaking about. "The grieving daughter," she had said, with the flat vowels of county sympathy, still wearing it like armor. Her sister had made a sound of agreement. A small group nearby had found other directions to look. Cecily had heard it, and had walked past it, and had taken her pew. She had been absorbing that kind of sentence for 3 months. She had become, without intending to, rather efficient at it. The christening itself was brief. The infant was called Edmund Philip Vane, which gave Cecily a moment she managed to absorb without visible consequence. Edmund was her father's name. She had not known Philip would use it. She understood, with the part of her mind that had long since stopped expecting people to mean well deliberately, that Philip had probably chosen it for reasons entirely separate from any consideration of her feelings, and that he had perhaps genuinely admired her father in the distant way that men admire people whose inheritance they have accepted without question, and that the coincidence of it, landing like a blow, was simply another instance of the world being arranged around her absence. She sat with her hands folded over her reticule and felt the weight of the silver watch inside the leather, and told herself, very quietly, that she had done harder things. She had. She had sat at her father's bedside through 3 nights of fever. She had signed the documents that transferred Ashcroft Park's administration to Philip's solicitor. She had dismissed the tenants she had known since childhood, each one separately, because she felt they deserved to hear it from her rather than from a legal notice slid under a door. She had done all of it without the word armor occurring to her. She had thought of it, if she thought of anything in particular, as simply what was required. She held the reticule in her lap, and the service went on around her. The reception afterward was held at Ashcroft Park itself, which was now Philip's house, and which Cecily entered for the first time since the solicitors had come. The front hall had been rearranged. Harriet had already moved the portrait of Sir Edmund from the first landing to a corridor she had apparently decided was for storage. Cecily did not pause at the empty wall. The wall's emptiness registered against her chest the way cold registers, as a fact and not as a surprise, because she had learned that facts do not become less factual for being surprised at. She went directly to the drawing room, which was crowded and warm and noisy with celebration, and she positioned herself near the east window, where she could stand with her back to the light and be seen by anyone who wished to see her, and overlooked by anyone who did not. The drawing room had been her father's favorite room. He had kept his books there, stacked in a fashion that Harriet had not yet quite addressed, but had already begun to look at in the measuring way of a woman determining where to begin. The chess table was still in the corner, though the pieces had been cleared away, and a vase of yellow jonquils placed on it instead. The vase was pretty. Cecily looked at it for a moment, and then looked at the window. She had been there perhaps 10 minutes when the Earl of Rexborough came to stand beside her. He did not announce himself, and he did not offer some social pretense of accidentally arriving in her vicinity. He simply walked across the room from wherever he had been and took up a position at the other end of the window alcove with the particular deliberate quiet of a man who has made a decision and does not require acknowledgement of having made it. He was taller than she remembered, which was strange because she did not think of herself as someone who remembered people in terms of height. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that seemed to be made of the same stone as the church they had just left, and eyes the color of the sky in November, that particular gray that is neither warm nor cold, but is very clearly paying attention. "Miss Vane," he said. "Lord Rexborough," she said. There was a pause that was not quite uncomfortable and not quite easy. He looked at her mourning dress with an expression that was entirely free of the performative sympathy she had been absorbing all morning, which was so unexpected that she found herself momentarily uncertain of her ground. He did not look away from the black crepe with relief, the way most people did. He simply looked at it, and then at her face, as though both were facts of equal weight, and he was considering both with equal seriousness. "You came," he said. "I was invited?" she said. "Yes." He looked briefly toward Philip at the center of the room, who was receiving congratulations with the air of a man who has won a competition he never precisely declared himself to be in. I imagine you were. It was not precisely a comment. He offered nothing further. She did not know what to do with a man who looked at her situation and did not immediately attempt to resolve it with kind words, which was a kind of consideration she had not expected, and which she found, against her better judgment, rather steadying. Most people who looked at her lately wanted to help. The wanting to help required her to manage their discomfort with her grief, as well as her grief itself, which was an additional labor she had grown very tired of. He looked at her reticule, and then his expression changed in a way that was too small to name, but entirely unmistakable. It was the expression of a man who has recognized something he did not know he was looking for. "May I ask," he said carefully, "what you are carrying?" She opened the reticule and took out the watch. It was an old silver thing, worn smooth on the case from 30 years of use, with a small dent on the back that her father had never explained. She held it out, not quite offering it, simply showing him. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. Something was happening in the vicinity of his jaw, a slight change that she could not identify precisely, except that it wasn't nothing. "Edmund gave you that," he said. His voice had changed register, just slightly, in the way a voice changes when it lands on something it did not expect to find. "He gave it to me the last week," she said. "He said the entail had no claim on a watch." He was right. He was quiet a moment. "I gave that watch to your father 31 years ago, when we were at school together. He had lost his own at cards, which he was too ashamed to tell his father. And I had a second one I had inherited from an uncle and had no use for." He paused. He kept it the rest of his life. She looked at the watch and then at him, and for the first time that morning something behind her eyes shifted in a way she had not planned. "He never told me," she said. "No," said Hugh Ashford. "He would not have." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "He was proud of you. He told me so. More than once. The last time I saw him, he told me there was one person in the world who would carry whatever he left undone, and that person would do it as though it were simply what was required, without complaint and without theater. He named you. He was not asking me to do anything with the information. He was simply telling me, in the way he told things that mattered to him, as a statement of fact." She put the watch back in her reticule and closed the clasp. She did not trust herself, just then, to say anything in particular. It was late in the afternoon, at a moment when the drawing room had thinned somewhat, and the principal guests had drifted toward the dining room door, that the incident with the christening robe occurred. The nurse, Mrs. Peel, a kind-faced woman of middle years who had been brought in from the village for the occasion and who had been managing the infant with a combination of expertise and visible anxiety since morning, had gone to lay the infant down in the adjoining room and had caught her heel on the carpet in the doorway and stumbled. The christening robe, which she had been carrying folded over her arm with the care of a woman who has been told twice that it is irreplaceable Flemish lace, dropped to the floor. Mrs. Peel caught herself against the doorframe and burst into tears with the abruptness of a woman who has been composing herself for 6 hours and has simply run out of material to compose from. Several guests nearby made gestures of sympathy and looked at each other in the way people look at each other when a thing wants attending to, and no one quite wishes to be the one who attends to it. Harriet Vane was at the far end of the room with Lady Dunmore and did not see. Cecily crossed to Mrs. Peel before anyone else had moved. She bent down and lifted the christening robe from the floor, shook it gently, and examined the lace with the particular attention of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking for, and has looked at lace before. She turned it twice in the light from the window. Finding nothing torn, She folded it precisely, in the way she had of folding things as though the fold itself were a form of respect, and placed it back over Mrs. Peel's arm. "It is quite undamaged," she said, "and you have done beautifully. 6 hours with that child in company, and he did not once cry out of turn." Mrs. Peel blinked at her, still undone. "He cried once," she said a little helplessly, "just before the reception." "That was the cold," said Cecily. "He was right to." She glanced toward the interior room. "Go and sit down for a moment. I will look in on him." She went through the door. The infant was in a small cradle near the fire, which was appropriate but slightly too warm, and he was working himself toward another objection about it, with the methodical application of a young person who has been inconvenienced by several consecutive hours of ceremony, and has arrived at the end of his patience with the entire enterprise. Cecily pulled the blanket back one fold to let some of the heat out. She put one hand into the cradle, just at the edge of his reaching fist, and he gripped her black-gloved finger, and stopped. She stood there for a moment in the firelit room with the noise of the party behind her, and the infant holding her finger, and the smell of the fire, this fire in this hearth, that she had sat beside all her life, and she was quite still. The watch was in her reticule on her wrist. She could feel it there. She thought about her father's hands, which had been large and had always been warm. And she thought about the fact that this room, which she had stood in 10,000 times, was no longer hers to stand in. And she thought about how little that changed the way the fire smelled, or the way the infant's grip felt against her gloved finger, or the way the silence in this smaller room was a different quality of silence than the one in the nave. She did not know that Lord Rexborough had come to the doorway behind her. She only became aware of him at all when the infant released her finger and looked toward the door with the vague but absolute attention of the very young, for whom the arrival of a person is always more interesting than any room they are already in. She straightened and turned. He was standing in the doorway with an expression that was, for a fraction of a moment, entirely unguarded. Then it settled back into the controlled gray attention she had come to recognize as his habitual register. She had seen it. She did not know what to do with what she had seen, except that she thought it was the expression of a man who has spent a long time being careful about what his face does, and who has been caught, briefly, not being careful. "He is not too warm," she said, because she had to say something. "No," said Hugh Ashford. "He looks well." He looked at her for a moment in the firelight. "You are good with children." "I am good with people who cannot be talked out of their feelings," she said. "It is much the same skill." He looked at her a moment longer than was strictly warranted. Then he stepped back from the doorway to let her pass. The drawing room had acquired a particular concentration of attention near the fireplace, where Lady Dunmore had established herself with the authority of a woman who treats every room as a venue she has agreed to inhabit on temporary terms. She was a large woman with magnificent jewels and the bearing of someone who has never been uncertain of her welcome anywhere, and she had been watching Cecily with the benevolent speculation of a magistrate who has already formed a view but has not yet pronounced it. Cecily had been aware of her all afternoon in the way one is aware of weather. She positioned herself now across the room by the bookshelves, where her father's books still stood, Harriet not yet having begun to address them, and she accepted a glass of ratafia from a footman she did not recognize, because the familiar faces were going one by one from this house, and she let herself look at the spines for a moment, and remember which of them she had read sitting in the chair that was now occupied by Lady Dunmore's niece. Lady Dunmore's voice carried clearly. "We all feel for her," she was saying to a woman Cecily did not recognize, a neighbor from the further reaches of the county, who had perhaps been told who the woman in black was. and was nodding with the attentiveness of someone receiving useful intelligence. The grieving daughter has had a hard season. No one disputes it. Only black at a christening is rather pointed, is it not? There is grief, and there is making a point of grief. And I do think the distinction matters in public company. The woman she was speaking to murmured something. "One thinks of the child," Lady Dunmore continued, "with the grandeur of a woman whose consideration extends magnanimously to all parties. An infant cannot be expected to arrange his birth around another family's losses. Philip has been very patient with the whole situation. Very patient indeed. If you have ever had your grief discussed as a matter of social etiquette within your own hearing, you know what silence sounds like from the inside of it." Cecily heard the words land. She felt them, which was unavoidable, and then she let herself feel them, which was the part she had learned. She did not turn her head. She took a small sip of ratafia and looked at her father's books. If you have been with her long enough to feel the weight of this afternoon accumulating, leave a word below when the moment moves you. It helps to know someone is watching alongside her. Lord Rexborough was standing perhaps 6 feet from Lady Dunmore. He had heard it. His expression did not change. He had, Cecily would later think, an uncommon capacity for stillness in the presence of things that would have moved a less disciplined man. His attention moved across the room to her with a kind of deliberateness that was entirely at odds with everything casual about the gesture, the way a compass moves, without haste, but without uncertainty. She looked back at him. She did not intend to look back at him. Her eyes found his the way a compass finds north. He lifted his glass slightly, just barely, the smallest possible gesture of acknowledgement. It was not sympathy exactly. It was something more like witness. The gesture of a man who has seen what just happened and is telling her, without words, that he has seen it. Then he looked away. She remained near the bookshelves a little longer. She was thinking, in the particular organized way she had developed for managing afternoons of this kind, about what the next hour would require of her. She had not yet looked in on the solicitor's table in the library, which was not her business anymore, and yet which she kept finding herself aware of in the way one is aware of a room one has always passed through without noticing, now that the passing through is no longer permitted. She thought she would ask for her coat in another half-hour, once the first dinner guests had begun to arrive, and her departure could be absorbed into the general movement of people in and out. She was making her quiet way toward the corridor when she heard it. Mr. Hobbs was a small man with a long face, and the habit of speaking at a volume that suggested he considered his voice a confidential document. He was near the library door, in conversation with Philip's brother-in-law, and Cecily caught her name at precisely the moment she would have walked past. "The grieving daughter has made rather a scene of it, hasn't she?" Hobbs was saying, in the carefully neutral tone lawyers use when they wish to convey judgment while retaining deniability. "We had all rather expected her to stay home. One wonders what she hopes to accomplish. The papers are signed. It is entirely settled. Philip was very generous in his way, in including her at all." She walked past the library door. She did not pause. She continued down the corridor toward the hall. And she put her hand into her reticule and found the watch. And she held it there for a moment without taking it out. Just the warmth of it against her palm. Just the weight and the tick. Philip Vane intercepted her before she reached the hall. He was not a cruel man. She had never thought of him as cruel. He was the son of a distant branch of the family who had grown up knowing that the law would eventually grant him something he had done nothing to earn, and the knowledge had produced in him a species of comfortable entitlement that he had long since stopped examining. He was solicitous and proprietary in equal measure, which was the particular combination of qualities that enabled a man to dispossess someone while believing himself to be helpful, and which ensured that his next sentence would be delivered with the expression of a physician recommending rest. "Cecily," he said. He used her first name with the ownership of a man who has recently been made to feel that he owns rather a great deal. "I hope you have found the afternoon satisfactory. We are glad you could come." "Thank you," she said. She kept her voice at its level. He glanced at her gown with the particular sideways reluctance of a man approaching a subject he finds distasteful. "We all understand your grief," he said. "Your father and I were not close in the years I would have wished for, but I respected him a great deal. However," he paused, gathering his charitable consideration around him like a coat, "I think you must feel, as we all do, that the christening is a day of joy for the family, and that a display of mourning, a visible one of this kind, can cast rather a particular shadow over an occasion that ought to be unclouded." "A display," she said quietly. "I do not mean it unkindly," he said. "Only that your father himself would not have wished you to make his memory a source of discomfort to others. He was always so very conscious of the feelings of those around him." He drew a breath. "I think, really, it might be best if you took your leave before the dinner. The evening guests will be arriving shortly, and we should not want anyone to misunderstand your situation, or to draw conclusions that reflect poorly on the family's hospitality. That is, on Philip's hospitality." She looked at him for a moment. She was very clear, in that moment, about what the situation was. She was standing in a corridor of a house that had been hers and was no longer, being asked to leave a room in which she had no power to refuse the asking. The machinery was precise and entirely impersonal, and had been functioning exactly as designed since the first solicitor had arrived in February. "I see," she said. She picked up her reticule from where she had left it on the hall table, and without entirely planning to, she took out the watch and held it in her palm for a moment. She was not certain why. She simply needed to hold it. It was warm, always warm, and it ticked with the steady patience of something that had kept time for 30 years without being asked whether it wished to. She turned toward the drawing-room door to retrieve her coat, and found Lord Rexborough standing in the doorway. He was looking at Philip. Philip had not yet registered his presence. "Rexborough," Philip said, turning with the jovial confidence of a man who has just successfully managed something and expects the next person he speaks to confirm the success. "Excellent timing. We are about to go in for dinner." "I heard what you said to Miss Vane," Hugh said. His voice was entirely level. The leveling was the point. Philip blinked. The joviality did not quite survive contact with that tone. "I hope you understand. It is simply a question of the occasion, and of what is appropriate. Miss Vane is the reason I made any promise at all." The room was not silent. It was the precise opposite of silent, with the noise of 40 people who have simultaneously become very attentive to everything, except the conversation they are listening to, with complete attention. Philip opened his mouth, and found nothing there to work with. Lady Dunmore, who had come through from the drawing-room and was now standing near the hall table with her fan held at a measured height, did not move. She was very still in the way a woman is still when she is revising her understanding of a situation rapidly and has not yet completed the revision. "Edmund Vane asked me to stand godfather to a child of his family's line," Hugh continued, in the same level voice. "He told me, when he asked it, that he had not many people left in the world who would stand for his family as a matter of genuine care rather than legal obligation. He named his daughter. He said she would carry what he could not leave her in the entail. He said she would carry it without complaint and without theater." He looked at Philip with the steady gray attention that was simply his habitual mode of seeing. "I have been observing her this afternoon, and I find that he was entirely correct in every particular." Philip said, "Rexborough, I assure you, this is a private family matter." "I will be calling on Miss Vane tomorrow morning," Hugh said, "to ask her formally whether she would consent to be introduced to my son, who is in want of company, and who knew her father through my descriptions of him. That is my intention. I am telling you now so that there is no ambiguity in anyone's understanding of the situation, or of where my interest in this family's welfare is principally located." He turned then and looked at Cecily. She was holding her father's watch. She had not put it back. He looked at the watch and then at her face, and then he crossed the room in 3 quiet strides and stopped at the appropriate distance, which was, in the suddenly very attentive corridor, an entirely proper distance, and also entirely charged with something that had nothing to do with propriety, and everything to do with the fact that he had been in the same room as her for 4 hours and had been watching what she did with a grief that most people could not have carried half a morning. "Miss Vane," he said, "I am sorry for what has been asked of you today, not only this afternoon, the whole of it." She looked at him. She was doing something in the vicinity of composing herself, but she was doing it slowly, which was unusual. She was generally faster. "You knew," she said. "When you saw me in the church, you understood it." "Yes," he said. "Immediately." "No one asked," she said. Not as an accusation, as a thing she had been holding since morning. "No," he said. "They did not dare." He said it without judgment toward those who had not dared. He said it as a man who had himself been afraid of many things, and knew what courage looked like when he stood in front of it. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she intended, and the watch was warm in her palm, and the corridor was very quiet in the way that matters, the way that a held breath matters before it is let go. Lady Dunmore set down her fan with a small, careful sound. Someone nearby began a sentence and thought better of it. Cecily put the watch back in her reticule. She called on him the following morning. She wore gray, which was the next shade out of full mourning, and which her aunt had suggested might be a little soon, but which she had chosen on her own authority, and without particular regret. She arrived at Rexborough House at the hour he had named, and she was shown to a small sitting room that looked out over a formal garden in its early spring state. Bare soil and the first stubborn green things, not yet committed to beauty, but entirely committed to persistence, which she felt that morning was a quality she could appreciate without reservation. Hugh Ashford was there before her. Beside him, in a chair that had been pulled close to the window, so that the light fell on the book he was holding, sat a small boy of about 3, with a face that was currently entirely focused on a large illustrated volume of British birds. The boy was slight in the way that is the result of illness, carefully survived rather than carelessly arrived at, and he had his father's particular gray eyes and his father's quality of paying attention to the thing in front of him without making a performance of the paying attention. "James," Hugh said, "this is Miss Vane. Her father was a great friend of mine." The boy looked up from the book. He regarded her with the unsentimental appraisal of the very young, which is the one form of assessment in which rank and dress and social position do not exist at all, and in which the only question being asked is whether the person standing before him is worth looking at. "Do you know about birds?" he said. "Somewhat," she said. She came and sat in the other chair by the window. "I know sparrows and robins and the ones that come when winter is almost over. I am less reliable on herons." He turned the book so that she could see the page he was on, which was, with the precision of a child who finds something amusing that he does not yet have words for, A heron. She looked at it gravely for a moment. "That is a heron," she said. "I retract my admission." The boy laughed, suddenly and entirely, with the whole of his body. Hugh Ashford was standing near the door, and he was looking at his son laughing, and his face did the thing it had done for a fraction of a moment in the nursery doorway at Ashcroft Park the day before. This time she saw it clearly, because she was closer, and because she was looking. It was not quite grief, and not quite relief, and not quite love, but it was the territory where all three of those things live, when they have been very close together for a long time. His wife had died when James was born. Cecily knew this from her father's letters, from the oblique way Sir Edmund had written about it. He had lost something, Edmund had written, and I do not think he entirely knows yet what he is to do with what remains. She had been 17 when she read it, and had not entirely understood it. She thought she understood it better now. She looked down at the heron in the book, and she thought about her father, who had carried a watch for 31 years without telling anyone where it came from, who had told a man she had not yet learned to know that she would carry things without complaint and without theater, who had known the precise weight of her and had written it down as a statement of fact to be held by someone who would still be standing after he was not. She took the watch out of her reticule. She set it on the small table between her chair and James's. He looked at it immediately, with the absolute directness of a child who has not yet learned that curiosity might be impolite. "It tells time," she said. "It was my father's. You may look at it." He picked it up with both hands, with the careful gravity of a child who has been taught that certain things are handled gently, and held it to his ear. "It ticks," he said. "Yes," she said. "It always does." Hugh came and sat in the remaining chair, not at the formal distance, at the distance of a man who has decided, as quietly and as completely as his son had decided about the heron, that he is in the right place, and that he does not intend to leave it. The morning light came through the window and fell on the garden, and on James with the watch, and on the gray of her gown, and on the chess set in the corner of the room, which was the same pattern as the one her father had kept, because Hugh Ashford had bought them in the same year from the same shop and had never replaced his. She noticed the chess set. She thought she would mention it. In a moment, outside the window, the spring came on in its reluctant way, and the bare ground gave up its first small green, and the watch ticked on James's palm between them, and the room was warm. If Cecily Vane's story stayed with you, leave a comment with the moment that meant the most. Thank you for staying until the end.